Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 5 player game, The Artemis Project, from Grand Gamers Guild. The Artemis Project comes with all of the components that you see here, including 60 energy markers, 35 toolkit markers, 60 mineral markers, 84 total colonists, 5 player mats, 10 player markers, a phase marker, an event marker, 14 event cards, 52 building tiles separated into ocean and surface tiles, 25 dice, 20 5x tokens, 35 expedition badges, 22 expedition cards, and 1 draw bag. The colonist meeples are separated into one of 4 different types. The game also comes with a game board and a cardboard piece known as the shake ship, which can replace the draw bag if you want to use that instead. Directions for how to build this are included in the rulebook. To begin setup, place the game board in the center of the play area. Then make some common supply piles of the expedition badges, minerals, toolkits, energy cubes, and 5x markers like shown. Place 4 each of the engineers, marines, and stewards on the board near the academy space. Then set aside 1 pioneer per player. Put the rest of the colonist meeples in either the shake ship or the draw bag, mix them thoroughly, and then place that draw bag near the doorstep portion of the game board. That's the space right here. Then you'll shuffle the building tiles into separate face-down stacks. If you're playing a 2-player game like we are in this example video, you want to make sure and first remove any tiles that have this symbol on them. After that's done, you can place those tiles near the game board. Next, shuffle the event cards and draw 6 from the deck. These 6 cards will be the only ones used in the game. The rest can be returned to the game box. You can place these events next to the game board and make sure to place the event marker near the deck as well. Then shuffle the expedition deck and place it face down near the base camp section of the board. Then each player will take a player mat and the matching dice and player markers of their color. Make sure and place the pioneer colonist in their shelters, and then give each player 3 energy, 3 minerals, and their toolkit. Then each player will place their 2 player markers on the starting spaces of the score track and of the relief track. Finally, select a starting player randomly and then give them the phase marker, and you're ready to begin. A game of the Artemis Project will last 6 rounds, and at the start of every round, including the first round, some setup will be required on the board. First, clear any cards that may be remaining in the base camp. Obviously, at the start of the game there won't be any. And then lay out new expedition cards equal to 1 less than the player count. So in our 2-player example, 1 card. And then add energy equal to the number shown in the top left of this card, plus 2. So in our example, you would add 6 total energy to this space of the board. If there are multiple expedition cards, like there will be in higher player counts, you add all the numbers together and then add 2. So for instance, in this example, there would be 9 total energy in a 3-player game. Then you follow the exact same process for adding minerals to this space of the board. Since this card also has a 4 in that space, 6 minerals would be placed as well. Then you'll add buildings from the appropriate stack equal to the player count. In rounds 1, 2, and 3, you would add buildings from this stack, and in rounds 4, 5, and 6, you would add buildings from this stack. So in our example, 2 buildings would be added next to the stack, and it's important to note that you would add to any remaining buildings from the previous round, so you don't clear away buildings from the previous round first. Then you'll add meeples to the doorstep section of the board, equal to the player count plus 2. These need to be drawn randomly from the bag, and you'll add to any that remain from the previous round, similar to the buildings. Finally, you'll draw the top card and reveal it from the event deck, and then place the event marker on the space of the board that matches the letter on the event card. In this example, this event would be placed on the letter G, reminding players to resolve the event during this resolution step in a later phase. And it's important to note that if an exclamation point is revealed, the event is resolved immediately. The Artemis Project is played over 6 rounds, and each round is broken up into different phases. The first being a placement phase, where players will roll their dice and then place them around the different locations of the game board. Then there will be a resolution phase, where the different regions of the board are resolved in a specific order. Finally, there will be an upkeep phase, where players can reset the board and prepare for the next round. Let's start by looking at the placement phase. At the beginning of the placement phase, players will roll all of their dice and then place those dice in ascending order from left to right on their player board. On a player's turn, starting with the player that has the first player marker, a player will select one of their dice and then play it to one of the 7 regions of the board. If you don't like the values on your dice, you can spend toolkits to change the values on those dice. For each toolkit spent, you can increase the value on one of your dice, either up or down 1. You can do this with multiple toolkits as long as you have them in your supply, but you can't wrap around, that is, to reduce a die from 1 to a 6 or vice versa. The first location where players can send their dice is to the base camp. When placing dice at the base camp, players are trying to complete expeditions that are set out at the start of the round. The first die placed on an expedition card will go near the bottom to indicate that that die was placed first. Any subsequent dice from other players will be placed above the first die in line. Players are trying to send dice whose total equals or exceeds the expedition value in the top right of the card. In addition to sending dice to the expedition card, players can also send colonists. To send a colonist, a player would have to spend 1 resource, and when the game refers to resources generically, it could be either a mineral or an energy cube. After paying the resource, the player could send one of the colonists from their shelters. A player can send multiple pioneers with their die if they want to by simply spending 1 resource. Each pioneer sent would raise the value of the die by 1, effectively increasing the die's number. You can do this even if the die value is 6. So for instance, this die would be worth 8 during resolution. A player could send only 1 engineer if they pay 1 resource, and if the expedition is successful, this player would gain 2 resources of any kind when resolving that die. The player could send 1 marine with their die if they wanted to by spending 1 resource, and this would allow them to physically change the value on one of the other dice on the expedition card by 1 or 2. You can only reduce the value, and you can't reduce the value of a die below 1. And lastly, if they want to, a player could send a steward with one of their dice by paying 1 resource. A steward has to be assigned with a die that has a value of 1 or 2 only. If the expedition is a success and that player is the first to choose a reward, they would gain 1 victory point in addition to the reward. This is difficult to pull off, but we'll look at this more during the resolution phase. The next 2 spaces on the board, the vents or the quarry, both use what the game calls an exposure mechanism when placing dice. On both of these locations, any die that's placed will need to go to the right of any die that has the same or lower value. So for instance, if the yellow player were to place a 2, it would have to go to the right of this green 2, as that value is the same. If the yellow player, however, were to place a 1, that would then slide all of the other 2s to the right. The order of dice placed on this location will matter, as the first person here gets first choice at the resources that are available, which we'll look at more during the resolution phase. The next action space to look at would be number 4, the gantry. When visiting this action space, a player will place a die on one of the available buildings. Placing a die is essentially placing a bid for how much you're willing to pay to construct these buildings. If a player places a die on a building, they're saying that they're willing to pay that many minerals to build the building during the resolution phase. If a player wants to, they can place a die on a building that doesn't have any dice on it, or they can place a die on a building that does have dice, as long as the value of the die is higher than any of the dice currently there. So for instance, the bid for this building is now 2 minerals by the yellow player. It's important to note that a player can outbid themselves or outbid another player who's placed dice on the building. And it's also important to note that you don't have to possess enough minerals to build the building when you're placing the die. You can get the minerals you need earlier in the resolution phase, as that location is resolved before the gantry. The doorstep is the next location that players can visit, and it uses the same exposure mechanism that was detailed on the vents and the quarry spaces. So for instance, players will place their dice with lowest starting first, and any die that's equal to or higher than this dice value would be placed to the right in the line. But if a player were to place a 1, it would slide this die to the right. The value of the dice placed here will unlock a certain number of colonists that the player can select during the resolution phase, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment. Players can also visit the Academy. There's only one space for a die in a 1 or 2 player game, and in a 3 or 4 player game there's a second space in the Academy. When placing in the Academy, a player can place any die value, and they have to place one colonist with the die that they place in this section. The colonist that's placed in this section will train into a different colonist during the resolution phase, and we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. And lastly, players can place any number of dice in the outfitter space in the middle of the board. If a player places a 1, 2, 3, or 4, they would gain 1 toolkit, and if they place a 5 or a 6, they would gain 2 toolkits. And these toolkits are awarded immediately. You don't have to wait until the resolution phase. When all players have run out of dice to place, the placement phase will be over, and then you'll move into the resolution phase. During the resolution phase, the players will place the phase marker and place it at the first space and resolve each location in order from 1 to 6 or from A to F. When a player is resolving a location that has the event marker, they will also resolve the text on the event card. In our example, the event isn't resolved until G, which will be after all location resolutions. If, however, the event card had said B, for example, the event would be resolved with this location during the resolution phase. When resolving the base camp, players will resolve each expedition card separately, beginning with the one closest to the deck and then proceeding outward if necessary. In our example, there's only one card to resolve. If the expedition total was met or exceeded by the total value of the dice, the expedition is a success and players will gain rewards. If the expedition total is lower than the value, the expedition is a failure and no one gets any rewards. Even though the players may not get rewards from the card, if the expedition failed, any player that has a die on that expedition card would get to move 1 space on the relief track. When moving on the relief track, the player will move to the next space and then immediately gain the reward shown on that space of the relief track. So in this example, 2 toolkits. If a player moves further down the relief track, they can either gain the reward for the space that they just moved to or any reward showing on lower spaces of the relief track. So for instance, by moving here, the player could either gain 2 minerals or either of the 2 rewards shown to the left. If a player ever reaches the last space of the relief track, they'll no longer be able to move their marker or gain relief track benefits for the remainder of the game. If the expedition was successful, any players who have dice at this location compare the totals of their dice value. Whichever player has the highest value gets to be the first to select one of the 2 rewards on the card. And if there's a tie, the tie is broken by the player who played their die earlier. So in this example, the green player has the highest total on this card. They would be able to gain 1 expedition badge, and then they could pick 1 reward from this card. The player with the second highest total would also get an expedition badge, and would get whatever reward is left over. If there were a third player in the game, and they didn't get any one of these 2 rewards, they would instead move their marker once on the relief track. And if there's only one player with dice present on the card, they would gain both rewards on the card, but they would still only gain 1 expedition badge. It's also important to remember that when resolving dice on these locations, players should carry out the abilities of any colonists that they've sent with their dice. So for instance, in this scenario, the yellow player would be the first to select one of the rewards, and they've assigned one of their stewards to a value 2 die, meaning they would gain 1 victory point in addition to the rewards that they select from the card. When resolving the vents or the quarry, players will collect resources equal to the die values that are placed, beginning from the left and then moving to the right. So in this example, the yellow player would receive 1 energy, and then the green player would receive 2. There may be a situation where a player isn't able to collect the full amount of resources. For instance, after collecting these 3 resources, the green player would only be able to collect 3 of the 4 listed resources because that's all that's left. It's also important to note that there may be situations where players aren't able to collect any resources because none are left when resolving one of their dice. If this were to happen, the player wouldn't gain any resources, but they would gain 1 on the relief track. When resolving the gantry section of the board, section 4, players will be allowed to build the buildings that they bid on during the placement phase. Any building tile that has dice on it is resolved separately, and the player that has the highest bid value has the option to build that building by paying the cost in minerals. So for instance, the yellow player could build this building by paying 2 minerals from their player supply. It's important to note that a player has the option not to pay for a building that they've bid on, or it's possible that they won't have enough minerals by the time this step comes up. If that happens, the player doesn't gain anything on the relief track, and then the option to build the building goes to the next player with the next highest value die, and so on. If, however, a player has outbid you and they choose to pay the resources and build the building, any player that has a lower value die would gain 1 on the relief track as a consolation for not being able to build the building. Any buildings not built will remain for the next round. Then the player will place the building tile next to their player board on the appropriate section. Ocean buildings go on the bottom half and surface buildings go on the top half next to the player board. And it's important to note that buildings have sections to place colonists. This will become important later because if a building is fully filled and staffed, resource production or a special ability could potentially be triggered later. Some spaces on a building can be occupied by any worker. These are just blank spaces. And then some spaces on a building require a specific type of worker, for instance a pioneer and an engineer. When a building is built, you can move colonists from your shelter to those spaces on the building so that those buildings will be fully staffed. And it's important to note that when sending workers to the academy to train them into different workers, you can send those workers from your shelters or from spaces on your buildings. When resolving the doorstep, space 5 of the board, dice will be resolved from left to right, and the owner of each die will be able to claim colonists from this space based on the value of their die. Any player placing a 1 or a 2, like in this example, would be able to claim 1 of the colonists. A reminder of this is printed on the board right here. For each colonist that a player gains, they have to pay 2 energy. And any colonist gained can go directly to the shelters or go onto a building space that matches their type or can accept them. With this value 3 die, the green player would be able to select 2 of these colonists, once again paying 2 energy for each. It is possible for a player to not be able to gain any colonists from this section if all of the colonists have run out before their die is resolved. If that happens, any player that has a die in this situation would gain 1 on the relief track. And it's important to note that players can voluntarily forego gaining any colonists if they want to, but they won't gain anything on the relief track if they voluntarily pass up on colonists. And finally, when resolving the academy, each player who has a die in the academy will train whatever worker they've placed there into a different worker based on the value of the die they placed. The type of worker that a player can gain is indicated to the right of these printed sections here. So for instance, with a value 6 die, this player would turn this pioneer into a steward. Any colonists that they've placed to train would be discarded from the game. And in games where there are 3 or 4 players, a second space is opened up, and these spaces are resolved from left to right. It's possible that on your turn, the worker that you should receive won't be available in this section because all of them have been taken. If that happens, you would gain the worker that you placed here back, but you wouldn't gain anything on the relief track. And as always, players can immediately place their new colonists into any of their buildings or their shelters. Once the resolution phase has been completed, players will move on to the upkeep phase. During the upkeep phase, the players will complete the following tasks in order. The first thing players could do is perform one move or swap. A player could either move a colonist from a space in the shelter to an empty space on a building, assuming that that building can accommodate, or back to your shelters from a building space. Or if a player wanted to, they could swap the position of 2 colonists in a building with the shelters. And this might be useful if a player wants to send a specific worker type on an expedition. Next, a player would be able to activate any of their fully staffed buildings. Ocean buildings will typically provide some sort of benefit or special ability, whereas surface buildings will typically provide an in-game scoring bonus. This building, for instance, would give the player an energy and a mineral. And it's also important to note that each building can only be activated once. After activating any fully staffed buildings, players would then need to pay 1 energy for each colonist in their shelters. If a player doesn't have enough energy to pay for all of the colonists in their shelter, they would have to discard some of the colonists from their shelter from the game. The player can choose which ones to discard. Players would then refresh the board just like they did at the start of the game, clearing out any expedition cards from the previous round and turning over new expedition cards, discarding any remaining energy or minerals, and then placing new energy and minerals based on what the new expedition card says, revealing new buildings equal to the player count, once again adding to any buildings that remain from the previous round, adding random colonists to any remaining in the doorstep equal to 2 more than the player count, and then revealing a new event from the event deck, once again placing the event marker on the appropriate letter based on what the event says. After this setup has been done, the player that has the fewest resources will choose the starting player for the next round. If there's a tie for this, the tied player that's furthest from the previous starting player in clockwise direction would choose. Then a new round would begin with the placement phase. After 6 rounds are complete, including the 6th upkeep phase, final scoring will take place. Players will add any victory points they've gained during the game, as well as 1 victory point for every 5 minerals or energy that they've saved at game end, for a maximum of 3 victory points each. They would gain the points listed for any fully staffed surface buildings. They would gain a number of victory points based on how many buildings they've completed. They would gain a variable number of victory points depending on how many expedition badges they've collected. For each full set of different colonists, the player would earn 3 victory points. And then for any colonists left over that weren't part of set scoring, the player would gain 1 victory point for every 3. So in this instance, the player would gain 1 extra victory point for these 3 remaining colonists. And then the player who has the most or is tied for the most number of remaining toolkits would earn 2 victory points. And the player with the most victory points would win, and in the event of a tie, the tied player who went earlier in the turn order of the final round would win. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. And make sure and connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild. Also, if you find these videos helpful or useful at all, please make sure to like and subscribe to help support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.